Hey everybody, we left off discussing cognitive maps and how at this time individuals were trying to understand how animals were solving mazes, simple or complex. And in the next few slides, we'll come back to this as we move to the neural mechanisms, but essentially that was the idea is what is going on neurologically that can help explain how animals are solving these mazes. Maybe the why are they doing it and how are they doing it? The neural elements of operant conditioning. James Olds and his colleagues in 1956 were first trying to figure out which brain regions might contribute to the process of reinforcement. So we know that we can train animals to execute certain behaviors. The question is, what's going on in the brain that allows this to happen? So through a process of trial and error, what they did is they inserted electrodes inside of a rat's brain, and they allowed the rat to press a lever. This lever would then stimulate the areas of the brain where these electrodes were implanted, with the goal to seeing if they could stimulate an area and it felt good, what do you think they would do? And if you guessed press the lever more frequently, that's exactly what they were looking for. Eventually, they found that the nucleus accumbens, which is in this limbic system, basically, if you go to the center of your brain, just in front of where the hippocampi lie, you would find this pathway, the limbic system, particularly the nucleus accumbens. And when the electrodes were there, they found that the rats would press the lever all the time. They would press it when they had food presented. It didn't matter. Nothing would break them from that desire to push that lever to feel good. More recent studies have identified other pathways involved in reward behavior, in particular the medial forebrain bundle, the hypothalamus, but most specifically, the nucleus accumbens. Neurons all along this pathway, and especially those in the nucleus accumbens itself, are all dopaminergic. So they secrete the transmitter dopamine. Much of this research has demonstrated that when these pleasure centers are activated, as I mentioned a moment ago, these animals will prefer to press a lever over other behaviors. But we've also learned that that behaviors like eating, drinking, drug use, and sexual activity also increase the rate of firing in the reward center, or they're all dopaminergic as well. There's different hypotheses about the precise role of dopamine. Now, we know it's more closely linked with the expectation of reward, more so than the reward itself. So, dopamine is more closely associated with wanting or even craving something rather than simply liking it. Nevertheless, whichever view this will turn out to be correct, researchers have found support for a reward center in which dopamine plays a key role, which is the nucleus accumbens. It's not surprising when we think about the urge, if you will, for these animals to engage in activities that elicit this response to make them feel good. What do you think would happen if we used drugs that block dopamine or significantly diminish their reinforcing effects? Well, in fact, when we've done this, what you'll see is that there's less activity because it's suppressed, but then there's also less desire to engage in these kinds of behaviors. So effectively, if they're not deriving pleasure from doing it, they're not going to do it. fMRI studies have shown increased activity in the nucleus accumbens when heterosexual men look at pictures of attractive women and in individuals who believe they're about to receive money. So with rats, we know that the primary reinforcers for them were things like food and water, and allowing them to engage in sexual activity also increases dopamine secretion in the nucleus accumbens, but only if they're hungry, thirsty, or aroused. So ultimately, we know there's a lot going on with these reward centers and how critical they are in eliciting behavior, especially in normal instances. But also, we know we can suppress them with different drugs to then see the consequential changes of behavior. This just gives you an idea of where the nucleus accumbens is, which is somewhat adjacent to the hypothalamus, near the hippocampus and the amygdala. and also where the medial forebrain bundle lie. Evolutionary elements of operant conditioning. We have to remember that rats naturally will forage for food in their respective environments. They'll even forage in places that are not reinforcing. And that's kind of counterintuitive when you think about it from a behaviorist perspective. If we put a rat in a tea maze, which is relatively simple, like you can see here below, and there's food in the top right corner, what do you think the rat will do when you place them in a maze like this? There's only two choices, to go up and go left or right. Now, let's say the rat, as you would predict, goes and gets the food in the right arm. And now we're going to put that rat back at the beginning start point of the maze, the bottom of that T. And on trial two, I want you to think, where will the rat go? So remember, it just found food in the right arm. What do you think will happen? And if you're thinking it's going to go and look to the right arm again because it just found food there, that's a great guess. But in fact, it was incorrect. What happened is rats would ignore the right arm and they would turn left. Now, if you're wondering why they would do this, it's because, remember, their natural inclination is to forage and find food. And if you know you went somewhere and just ate the food that was there, why would you go back? You know the food's gone. You just ate it. So it's important when we design experiments to consider how each species, including humans, is biologically predisposed to learn some things more readily than others in ways that are consistent with their evolutionary history. So if we struggle to wonder, why is a rat not going where they just found food? That doesn't make sense. They should be doing it. Sometimes what we think is the explanation for why things occur isn't necessarily the correct one. In the end, it's almost argued that the animal is right. It's not that it did something wrong in this case, it's that it's doing something it's naturally going to do to avoid making a mistake, if you will, and going back down an arm it's previously been down, because it knows the food was just there. Even in complex mazes, you don't typically observe rats going back down an arm they've already visited. In fact, they never do this. They're really good at foraging through very complex environments and not making a mistake. They know where they've been, and they're going to continue searching forward, if you will, to find food. That's particularly advantageous because if you're making a mistake, you're not going to remember where you've been and what you've done in that particular location. So, from an evolutionary argument, it makes sense in these complex T mazes that rats will continue to forage onward in the pursuit of food. Now, we know dopamine is playing a critical role in reinforcing behaviors. Schultz and colleagues were trying to understand how dopamine neurons play an important role in generating reward prediction error. And related findings and understanding that we're trying to seek out behavior that rewards us for doing so. So these networks become active. And reward learning can be impaired in persons who have Parkinson's disease. Now, we mentioned, a couple of slides ago that if we administered a drug that decreases the amount of dopamine produced in animals, they're less likely to engage in reward-seeking behavior. Now, in individuals who have Parkinson's disease, that's effectively what's happening. The dopaminergic pathways are disrupted, and as a consequence, these individuals may struggle or become impaired in reward-related tasks. With that said, so there's basically a disruption in the reward prediction error signal. But if you have Parkinson's disease, one treatment is to administer L-DOPA, so synthetic dopamine. The attempt here is to have neurons then produce more dopamine, and as a consequence, decrease some of the symptoms they experience. But as a consequence of taking dopamine, the reward pathways, if you will, can become active. This may result in individuals who have Parkinson's displaying compulsive gambling or shopping, effectively impulsive behaviors. It may be related to the consequence of the drugs they're taking that stimulate these receptors to make them feel good. So future studies that combine drug manipulations with neuroimaging and controlled learning paradigms should have some important scientific and practical implications in understanding behavior. Another way we can look at learning is through observation. Think about yourself. Maybe you're a younger sibling and you've watched, and even if you're not, you've seen friends engage in behavior, you see how other people react to it, and we're really quite good, if you will, looking at others to gain information about things they're doing and effectively how they're treated for simplicity. A famous study by Albert Bandura wanted to look at how observational learning, which is effectively a condition where learning takes place by watching the actions of others. And we do this across appropriate social behaviors, as well as across and within the cultures of which we're raised in. So think about all the activities we've been presented with on how to act. Effectively, chewing with your mouth closed. You may have heard it once, and then you learn pretty quickly that that's something that people would prefer. Van Der decided to have kids observe an adult enter a room with a bunch of toys. And they wanted to see how the kids would engage with the toys depending on what the adult model did. And in the image I'll show in a second, a woman goes into the room and she will engage in this Bobo the clown doll. It's one of those dolls that has a little bit of a weighted bottom and it's filled with air. So if you punch it like a punching bag, it'll just go down and pop back up. And the doll itself is not necessarily important. It's what the adult actor did with it. And she beat it up. And she was, implying to the kids when they have a chance to come in there that they can, do the same kinds of things she's doing. Like it was a fun thing to do, if you will. She also hit it with tools like a hammer. And it wasn't surprising to see that when the kids were given the opportunity to go in there and play with the toys in the room, they went to the Bobo the Clown doll and they treated the doll the same way that the adult was treating it. So they're imitating that behavior. We're arguing now that they're sensitive to the consequences of aggressive behavior. Now think about what would happen if the adult went in the room and ignored that clown doll. What do you think the kids would do? And that's another condition of the same study which occurred. So the woman actor goes into the room and she doesn't interact with Bobo the Clown doll. She interacts with other toys, and then kids are allowed to go into the room and play. And they didn't beat the clown doll up. They didn't punch it or kick it, didn't hit it with a hammer. It was really important that they only imitated the behaviors that they watched the adult engage in, which is really called diffusion chain. If you watch, in this case, the adult play with a toy in a particular way, then you've learned what you could do with the toy in the same manner. And if others watch you, now you're the actor initiating the behavior that others are learning from. And this continues onwards. It's almost to say good behavior, if you will, becomes infectious, or poor behavior can also become infectious. So it's a process in which individuals initially learn a behavior through observation of another person performing that behavior, and then you become the model for which others would learn that behavior as well. So it's kind of that lead by example. So if you look at the images here, you'll see that in the top left, the female mounts the Bobo the Clown doll, and then you can see that the little boys and girls, when they could go in and do it, did the same thing. In the second from the top left, when she threw or tossed the clown in the air, the kids did the same thing. When they hit it with a hammer, the boy and the little girl down in the third row, or column here, sorry, also did the same exact thing. And they kicked the doll, the kids kicked it as well, effectively demonstrating that the children were being aggressive towards the doll similarly as the adult was. And this behavior occurred in the absence of any reinforcement. They just watched and they went in and played how they wanted to play, arguing that observational learning was responsible for the children's behavior. Recent research through observational learning is especially effective when people can observe both experts and novices perform a task, so you can avoid making mistakes. Think about if you've learned to do any sport or musical instrument. Often it's great when you can look at your coach or your music teacher and see how they do it, because you're trying to model your behavior, if you will, after them. If you've played sports, think of how important it is when um, you've had a coach that you can really relate to, demonstrate some skilled behavior, and you're like, oh, I can see how you do it. And in fact, the further you progress in sport, the more reliant we are on observing others to demonstrate the kinds of things we need to see, which is really important in acquiring these further enhanced skills, effectively developing expertise. Although if we interrupt performance of motor tasks, it can impair the ability to actually do it. But if you impact or interfere with performances, it only impacts the person trying to carry out the motor task. It has no impact through observational learning of the interrupted task. So observational learning can be a bit more flexible than physical motor learning, but the caveat is observational learning can help to a degree, but it's certainly not going to result in expertise being acquired through just watching. You have to actually engage in a task to become proficient in it. So that's sort of the caveat with the last point is that, yeah, it might be more flexible in certain cases, but it's certainly not more flexible in all cases. It is critically important that we actually carry out actions. But observational learning isn't just limited to people. It has also been observed in animals. So a variety of species, such as pigeons, pigs, monkeys, um, have all been used to demonstrate observational learning. Pigeons have been used effectively to get reinforced for pecking behavior. And if other pigeons observe them pecking in a particular way that we want them to, they're more likely to engage in the same behavior. Rhesus monkeys also learn to fear snakes through an observational diffusion chain, so they can see how other rhesus monkeys respond to stimuli, and they themselves will now respond the same way when others watch them, just so on and so forth, which exemplifies a biological predisposition to fear snakes, because they did this in a laboratory environment where these monkeys had never lived in the real world to understand um, that snakes could be a spherical stimuli for them. It just naturally is one. This suggests that diffusion chains are not unique to humans, and they are indeed important, and in fact critical behaviors for survival in the real world. They also took this a little bit further with observational learning in monkeys, and specifically with chimpanzees, because they can learn to use tools like we use tools. And if you had monkeys that were reared in the wild by their mothers or by human families, we found that if we showed them how to achieve a particular goal to get the food through stabbing an object through the center of the lid of a container and opening it up. So imagine you're trying to open the lid in the top picture. You're just going to stab it in the center and pop it off. Or down below, you could use the tool to pry the lid open, almost like a paint can. What they found was that when you compared reared in the wild chimps by their mothers, or there were chimps that were raised by human families, they were more likely to mimic the more human-like behaviors than ones raised in the wild. So both groups showed evidence of observational learning, but the human reared monkeys were more likely to carry out the exact action they had watched um, that they watched humans execute or carry out, more so than the ones that were naturally reared in the wild. So the influence of humans raising animals is then demonstrated by they're more likely to act similarly to the way that we would than what they would naturally do if they're raised in the wild. How does this happen? You'll recall that we talked about mirror neurons previously. So it's likely the case that if we understand the actions of the behaviors we're witnessing, then it's going to elicit activity in mirror neurons that help us to understand what was going on and how to do it. So they fire whether we engage in the activity itself, like prying the lid open or lifting or stabbing it through the center to regain or gain access to the food in the box. Whether we do it or watch someone do it, it's the same areas become similarly active. So we know area F5 of the macaque monkey is where mirror neurons are located through single cell recording. In humans, it appears to be in Broca's area, as well as in frontal and parietal lobes. And fMRI studies have shown that the same areas are active when we engage in a task or observe others in a task. So observational learning of motor skills really depends on the motor cortex. And we know this because if we use TMS, what we can do is we can inhibit the ability of people to learn these skills by disrupting how the motor cortex fires during skill acquisition. Effectively blocking the ability for these neurons to fire disrupts learning, which demonstrates it's critically important for task, for observational learning, and as well as actually execution of said task. This is just showing where the mirror neuron systems appear to be in humans. They aren't definitive. It's hypothesized, and even though the areas are there, like 44 is really Broca's area or some more similar to it. It's only about 30% of neurons in this area have been found to mirror behavior. Nevertheless, they do seem to play a critical role in imitation of behavior, as well as understanding the prediction or likelihood that a future behavior will occur. Switching gears just a bit now, implicit learning is learning that takes place without conscious awareness. So you're not necessarily aware of the learning that has taken place despite having knowledge. Now, it's likely the case, and as the textbook uses a good example, you probably remember the first time you learned to drive a car. Think of all the stimuli you're presented with when you first just sit in the driver's seat, put the seatbelt on. Um, you know, there's so many things you're not really aware of or you're paying attention to that it makes learning to drive, for some, a really overwhelming process. There's a lot of things that we're paying attention to. Now think about how you drive a car today and think about trying to explain to someone how to do it. You might just say, you get in the car, start it up, and go. Now, while we've skipped several steps in that brief description, the reality is we don't really think about everything we're doing when we're driving a car now. It becomes somewhat automatic, or we could say unconscious. There's the implicit part of it. So some forms of learning, again, they may begin explicitly, but then they become more implicit over time. We also talked about habituation at the beginning of this lecture. We're just coming back to it a bit now, where similarly with implicit learning of not being aware of what's going on, habituation is a process where with repeated exposure, the amount of activity to these stimuli will change over time. In fact, we know that they'll decrease. So do implicit and explicit learning mirror implicit and explicit memory? And really, both distinctions refer to memory or learning without awareness versus learning with awareness. So implicit and explicit memories can refer to retrieving information about something in the past. And implicit and explicit learning typically refers to how we acquire knowledge and skills. So more importantly, when we think of learning and memory, they're linked together. It's kind of difficult to tease apart how something begins explicitly, but then becomes more unconscious, if you will, over time. And nevertheless, the ability for you to drive a car is relatively automatic. Think about trying to tease out the unconscious things you're aware of versus what you're consciously or explicitly aware of. You can't really do that. It's not typically how things would take place. Implicit learning studies have, if you look at the book to review this, they use things like artificial grammar rules. And it's a really abstract thing to do when you look at the textbook example of what was there. I think I can show you, it's on another slide. The grammatical strings on the left were told to students that there are patterns, if you will, there are rules or a prototype of these strings. And it's more about how we actively seek out the relationships between things versus if we just sort of passively process the information or implicitly process the information. And people that thought there were patterns or grammatical rules to these very artificial sequence of letters were more likely to be better able to find the patterns that were there. And then when future strings were shown, they were more likely to apply those, what they thought were rules, to the sequences to determine if they were in the correct order or not. Similarly, with serial reaction time tasks, they would have boxes that would light up one after the other in serial order. And participants would have to press a button that corresponded to each box as they lit up. If participants were able to somehow find patterns in what was going on, they were better able to then press the button of the box that would light up faster than those that couldn't seem to locate a pattern in how they would appear. Implicit learning characteristics really have demonstrated that there are relatively little differences in tasks themselves. Your ability to participate well in these kinds of experiments is unrelated to your overall intelligence. We do know that over our lifespan, we can see that there is changes in our implicit memory, or how we're better able to use systems that have developed to acquire learning or information to form memories, are then better able to use information implicitly. It's also been found to be resistant in some disorders, especially individuals who have amnesia. Remember, people with amnesia are often not able to identify what they've experienced explicitly as it is to them, but they are able to still acquire information. So implicit memory is its own separate pathway that seems to be intact in individuals who have amnesia, whereas explicit pathways sometimes we'll see that problems occur. So these are just with the grammatical strings that were presented. You can review this as it pertains to the example I stated about the grammatical rules that apply to these strings and how judgments were better likely to be made on future strings when they thought there was the rules applied to it than just if there wasn't. So implicit and explicit learning. And we know that these pathways, picking up where I just left off, are distinct neural pathways because amnesics show intact implicit learning but impaired explicit learning. Damage, particularly to the hippocampus and the medial temporal lobes, does impair explicit memory. Henry Molaison, or HM, was a clear example of this, where he was unable to learn anything that he was consciously aware of experiencing for the remainder of the, 6 decades of his life. But implicitly, HM could learn. He could learn to solve tasks. He just wouldn't know how he knew. So when participants are shown implicit patterns, like in visual dot displays, and they're given explicit instructions to look for patterns, shown ultimately they display different areas of neural activity than those who were given implicit instructions, like there is nothing, there's no rhyme or reason to the patterns that will be displayed. So the implicit instructions show occipital lobe activation, suggesting there's visual processing. This particular study they're describing with visual dots, it's like looking up at the ceiling of your bedroom, and it's all filled with what look like stars shining. So the dots were intended to mimic stars. And in one group, they were told to try to find the patterns in the dots that were displayed, even though there weren't any. And then the other group said that basically just look at the lights. So the implicit instructions, there's nothing there. So what they're seeing is differences of activity of visually searching for it in the implicit instruction, hence the occipital lobe activation, whereas the group looking for the ability to see the patterns there elicited different patterns of activity neurologically, more so than just the occipital lobe. Other studies, artificial grammar learning and the sequence learning via serial reaction times, have shown that Broca's area and the motor cortex are respectively involved in how we implicitly learned tasks. And here you can see the areas that are active during implicit and explicit learning. They're activating different regions. So the implicit task, where we're not really looking for the patterns in the light, it's just the occipital lobe effectively lit up. But if you look at the explicit learning, we can see the left temporal lobe. So you're actively trying to seek it out. So it's not surprising to see the prefrontal cortex, the right frontal lobe, the parietal lobe engage in activity to seek out relationships between the stimuli presented in various experiments. What about learning across different cultures, at least as it pertains to implicit learning? Now, cultural influences have been shown to be different in implicit learning, specifically that Westerners engage in analytic perceptual processing, focusing on an object independent of its context. Easterners, on the other hand, engage in holistic perceptual processing, focusing on the relationship between an object and its content. If you look at the image shown in the textbook, there are basically letters that were forming a shape of another letter, but they weren't the same ones that were presented there. And as a consequence, I'm trying to see what exactly are participants seeing when these letters are displayed. I'm just quickly trying to find it in the textbook here while I'm recording. 1 second. Because what's fascinating when you look at the actual patterns themselves. So if you look on page 283 of your textbook, you'll see, well, what will you see? Do you see on the bottom left N, V, J, T, V, J? If you do, that's really what we're looking at as differences of the Western perspective of we're seeing that the letter B forms a letter N, which is the first one that we see. Typically in Asian cultures or Eastern cultures, sorry, they were arguing that what did they see? They would see B, Y, Y, F, L, B, the individual letters that compose the other letters, not necessarily the shapes of the other pairings that would form themselves. So it's really just a difference of strategy, if you will, of dealing with information. So even though we're presented with information, it's what are we really seeing? What do we focus on? What are the elements of the objects that contribute to our ability to learn? Resulting that these glocal strings, think of it like global, which they're using here, but it's glocal in the sense that it's just the bigger letters that were formed rather than the underlying pieces, which is really the implicit piece that operates under our conscious awareness, which is immune from cultural influences. So the analytic and holistic processing is closely related to how we typically are raised to deal with information and just underlying cultural differences because of that. Now, one of the important things you're probably all engaging in is studying for exams. By the time we get to this point of the course, it's not only the material of this lecture we have to deal with, it's other courses, and it's the culmination of all the information that we have to deal with. So how do we break it down? How do we break information down to best understand what is being presented and how we can try to best understand it? And I know that a lot of people attempt to just read the book, or maybe we'll reread it as the exam date gets closer. But despite popularity, highlighting areas of your book or rereading it or summarizing your notes, creating visual imagery mnemonics, they're not very effective techniques at learning to remember the content of the various information you're presented with. It's not to say that they don't work, though. It's just to say that they're not as effective as other techniques. So, the high effective technique is practice testing. So, imagine you read a couple pages and then you stop and you try to find some questions at the end of the textbook, like short answer questions that pertain to what you just read. It's how well can you answer that information that's there. So distributed practice or practice testing. Practice testing is really more how often have you studied and you've put together some practice questions, and then you set a timer. So you really try to mimic the test conditions that you'll be faced with. Doing so, I don't think is surprising to sound like it's really effective in our ability to perform as best as we can. So that's why it's really effective. If we distribute our practice and we break it out over time, different sorts of assessments as we process information, it's also highly effective in helping us to understand what's presented there. We can also engage in techniques like collaborative interrogation or self-explanation or interleaved practice to help us perform better. So we'll go through what some of these are. Distributed practice is spreading our studying activities out over time with repetition. So we want time between periods of repetition to study the information of the to be learned information. Cramming is not, and we know that 25 to 50% of students cram. I get it. We've all been there, and we've neglected our studying. We just have to jam everything in there. Um, it is better than doing nothing. But mass practice itself, studying information with little or no time between repetition, like what Ebbinghaus did, it does result in some learning, but it also results in quite a bit of forgetting. Do you remember that as well? Interleave practice involves a practice schedule that mixes different kinds of problems or materials within a single study session. So we're really critically thinking about the information we have. We're trying to not just read it, we're trying to, I guess, effectively say, learn it. And it requires you to choose a strategy about how to deal with each of these problems themselves. And the fact that you're able to do this, really what it results is what we'll call deep learning as opposed to shallow learning. The benefits of interleaving is that it's documented for some subjects like social science concepts and various kinds of visual patterns. So there could very well be benefits to this. I'm reluctantly not going to say it's going to cause you to do better because that's not the case. It may, but it also may not. But breaking it up could also help you to best prepare for a test. But the other challenge when we break things up over time is that, well, we know forgetting occurs. And the problem is how much of the information you've studied last week is really still retained this week as you're replacing it with new information. The disadvantage of interleaving is that there's very little research that this is based on, meaning it's usually just done in a laboratory, not necessarily in the real world. So while things may be effective, it's also the case that they may not be. The techniques for learning, practice testing. If you effectively practice testing similarly to how tests will be administered. In this instance, all the students would have to complete short answer questions at the end of a term. And what they found were students were given practice testing in blue. Um, so practice short answer questions to consider throughout the term. They were statistically better, if you will, at recalling information than the other two conditions, which was restudying, where the group would then just reread the content with the term, whereas not tested, whereas they didn't do any practice questions, nor did they restudy the information, resulted in less. But the differences between restudied and not tested, I don't believe were statistically different, or it wasn't reported. So obviously the best thing to do is in situations where the test is difficult. That's the other caveat. But this is most beneficial when testing's difficult because you really want to think about this difficult information, if you will, differently than other easily acquired information. It's also effective with verbatim learning and transfer learning, just as memorizing things. And in the end, yes, repeated practice testing does in fact help with learning. It results in better recall than just rereading the notes themselves. So the take home is really, if you're able to read the notes and practice the questions as you're studying, it seems to help improve performance, especially when writing a test. There's also testing aids that help with attention. And I think part of the challenge when we're learning information, especially while we study for an exam, and we've all been guilty of this during the lecture, is mind wandering. It's natural for us to just zone out, think about the text message your friend sent you, the fun you had the weekend before, or whatever else comes to mind. If the information of the lecture is dry, I get it. We're just going to zone out and not really focus on what we have to do. How do we change that? And one of the methods that was found to be effective that I don't know if we always do this well is during a lecture is to tell students at some point you may have a question that's going to appear on this. Basically, I'm going to quiz you on the content. How is that going to change your behavior? How's it going to change how you look at and treat potentially information? And brief tests during lectures can improve learning and reduce the tendency to mind wander. So, what they would also do is randomly throughout the lecture, they would pause and put a question up. How many of you are mind wandering right now? And they found that in adding these quizzes decreased mind wandering, which was reportedly at about 40% to about 20%. So, if you're focused your attention on the content because you think you're going to be quizzed in real time, you are less likely to mind wander. And part of the testing value attributed to this encouragement to attend lectures, and it really discouraged task irrelevant activities. So effectively, the threat, if you will, of a quiz is resulting in better attention to the material during lecture. Control of learning. Eventually, while you're studying, you're going to make an assessment, a judgment, if you will, whether or not you already think you know the information and not spend time on it and skip it and focus on something else. So assessments are made about how well information is learned and used to control future studying. You will spend more time on items you judge you have not learned well. As a consequence to spending time learning something you've judged not to learn well, you may develop overconfidence. And this feeling of familiarity, because you've read the content, can actually be misleading and it can detract from effective studying. Oh, I don't need to do that. I just looked at it. And as a consequence, you're overly confident. And I don't need to do it because I did it, which that familiarity of having done it might be detrimental to your ability to actually understand what the information is and to recall it later during testing. How do we overcome this subjective impression that we develop about our learning? One thing to do while we're studying is to use self-testing periodically under exam-like conditions. So maybe you read a chapter or a few pages and you have your friend ask you some questions, or maybe you Google some practice multiple choice questions in your instance, and you try to see how well do you understand the content. And if you're doing really well on them, then there's probably a good chance you have a great understanding of this information. If you're struggling with it, it's probably the case you need to go back and review it again. But mimicking or mirroring test conditions is obviously very beneficial because now you're best prepared in studying, if you will, for the exact conditions you will face when you write the test. It's important to also compare your personal understanding of something to the textbook's understanding of it. In fact, I'll encourage students in courses like statistics to think about what does this mean to you in your own words. And I recognize that in part it's an activity to see how well do students really understand the information that's presented to them. It's okay to struggle, but I want to know beyond the rote memorization of a term, do you really get it? And it is important to think about then what you really get. How do you think about it? And how close is your thinking to the actual definition? So it's really taking a time, and I recognize this is a big lift. It's taking a lot of time to not just read something, to really think about it, to be quizzed on it. The metacognition of being aware of what you know and then trying to be evaluative and recognize the overconfidence may or may not be a thing, meaning you may actually know a lot about it, or You may not, but you believe you do anyway. So overall, how we learn and what we learn, it is fascinating. It is complex. And the goal of learning is obviously to remember. But what happens when we lose learning, which is a weird way of not necessarily, well, it's forgetting, the dangers of forgetting or the dangers of learning loss. I think we all can appreciate the challenges that COVID-19 made us face. We went from a typical learning environment in the schools to being socially isolated at home. And when we looked at the consequences of being isolated at home in 6,500 high school students, it wasn't surprising to see significant declines in social, emotional, and academic well-being during the initial change when we went from the classroom to at home. Now, I did read this last part in the textbook, and it's worth saying that they didn't present anything on Black and Brown students. It's almost like you'd have to be left to go read the actual entire report. But they did mention racialized and indigenous populations as more likely to suffer from learning loss. And what factors do you really think, or why would this happen? It is important to know that many efforts have been put in place to try to assist those that have challenges learning the information, not just to begin with, but to begin with and to continue with. The Head Start program in the US was designed to help determine which children required assistance to catch up, to get a head start, if you will, before they start um, junior kindergarten. When COVID happened, what effectively occurred was a loss of knowledge. And it's trying to figure out what are the consequences to this. And then how do we help those teenagers, those young men and women, identify what was lost and then regain those skills so that they can adequately catch up. And to do that isn't just as simple as asking questions and figuring it out. This becomes the multi-million dollar objective to try to then fix the problem that occurred because of something like COVID-19. And part of the challenge why you see racialized groups sometimes struggle more than others is also due to the conditions in which they live. So socioeconomic status can be a factor. And I'm not saying everyone that's, Black and Indigenous is poor, but if you see that in certain demographics that unique challenges exist, then it's not surprising to learn that you need unique solutions for unique problems. And money is not necessarily going to just fix a problem because ultimately it's about, I mean, while it can help fix the problems, it's not always readily available. Um, in the class, when we discussed this particular piece, it's the challenges of things like the internet or geographical locations and all the other contributing factors that may play into why students struggled. But specifically, as the questions posed of the failure rates, this wasn't noted in the book, so I can't really speak to it. With that said, that brings us to the end of chapter 7, as well as the end of the content for this course. I'd like to thank you for your time and your patience mostly as we sorted out a new learning system. But nevertheless, I hope you enjoyed the first half of Intro to Psychology. I wish you well in your exam preparation. I hope you have a lovely break and best of luck with your rest of your studies at Algoma University. Take care, everybody. Thanks.